I'll let you guys know, and we'll go from there. So, with that out of the way, that's what happens when you forget to put something into your notes for announcements. Okay. Well, we've been talking about Jesus Christ for a long time. Not a bad thing to do on the Sabbath, I would say. Not a bad thing to do as a Christian as we're considering things with him as our elder brother. But it has been a wonderful study for me in putting these together. And today, as we're looking at, we're going to pick up a little bit where we left off. The last time we talked about the story of Jesus, we were looking at his actual baptism. We talked a little bit about why he would have needed to be baptized there to function as the high priest and the rationale for that. And it's after he's baptized that a few things happen. Let's go ahead and let's open up to Matthew chapter 3, the tail end of it there. Matthew chapter 3. So he'd gone out to the Judean wilderness, or where John the Baptist had been, and that's where John the Baptist had been preaching, in the wilderness of Judea. And he was baptizing people, as we've covered, beyond the Jordan, at Bethany beyond the Jordan. And we see in verse 13 of chapter 3 here in Matthew chapter 3, verse 13, Jesus came from Galilee, up in the north. He comes down to Jordan to be baptized, and John tried to prevent him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and are you coming to me? And Jesus answered and said to him, permit it to be so now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. And he allowed him. And when he had been baptized, Jesus came up immediately from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting upon him. And suddenly a voice came from heaven saying, this is my Son, my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And so we see this amazing presentation, not only of the baptism of Jesus, but of God acknowledging that. And we do understand that later on when the disciples were looking for a replacement for Judas, one of the requirements was it was an individual who had seen this occur, because it had to be somebody who was with them from the time of John the Baptist following along. So the eyewitnesses, the individuals who were there to ascertain or to be able to verify what had happened to Jesus throughout the entirety of his time, and that's where you have Matthias is chosen. Now, chapter 4, verse 1 here in Matthew. Chapter 4, verse 1, it says, then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Now, a lot of people, a lot of cultures have something you could say that is like this. If you're from Australia, perhaps you have a walkabout. If you are more of a Native American or another sort of cultural background, you might have a vision quest. If you're watching movies, corny movies, they call them coming-of-age stories, right? These people kind of come into their own, but what they end up doing during the course of that vision quest or the walkabout or the coming-of-age story is they have to figure out who they are. They have to be tested. Their mettle is tested. It's tried out. Sometimes you might have a sort of thing compared to climbing your own Mount Everest, or just whatever the struggle is that you're trying to portray. We recognize that people go through these sorts of things. And so as Matthew was recording here in chapter 4, it's a beautiful thing because we get to see with Jesus Christ that he goes through this. I mean, it's the apex, it's the pinnacle. He's 30, we talked about this now. He's mirroring David, King Saul. He's mirroring Ezekiel. He's mirroring the priesthood. At 30, he's coming into his own as the opportunity, to have an opportunity within that cultural context to be a substantive rabbi, teacher, a person that others would look to. And that is just cemented by what all the individuals witnessed there during the baptism of Jesus Christ by John the Baptist. And then he goes out into the wilderness. And this is a huge thing. We talked about location, right? And how location, all this stuff is important. God is not doing this by accident. And what we've seen over the course of the life of Jesus, as we've talked about it, is how much he is mirroring what God has been doing with Israel. Whether you're Abraham and you're starting up in the promised land, walking all about it to see it, for preservation, you go down into Egypt, and out of Egypt he calls his son, comes back up, going through this journey, crosses over, is baptized in the Jordan. Well, for Israel, being in the wilderness is kind of like a vision quest, a walkabout. It's a coming of age thing, because that's where they went. If you go to Genesis, keep your spot here in Matthew chapter 3. We'll go to Genesis 32. Genesis chapter 32, verse 24. We're going to look at some well-known stories for the people of that time, and probably for us here today as well. Genesis chapter 32, verse 24. And we know that they were well known by the people of that time because we see the Pharisees, we see individuals referencing them to some extent as they're having discourse with Jesus during his ministry. But in Genesis chapter 32, verse 24, Jacob is out in the wilderness. He gets up. If you remember the just background here, he's left his father-in-law Laban's, and he's going to go meet his brother. He's found out that his brother Esau is coming, so he sets everybody in array. His favorite ones closest to him, his least favorite ones farther out, that sort of thing, so you know where you stand in a family. And verse 24, he's left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. And when he saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, "Let me go, for the day breaks." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men, and have prevailed." And Jacob asked, saying, "Tell me your name, I pray." And he said, "Why is it that you ask about my name?" And he blessed him there. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. He's out there in the wilderness. He is on the cusp of, is my brother going to kill me? Am I going to get through this? I just left, we say out of the frying pan into the fire. He just left a less than desirable family circumstance, living with his father-in-law, being taken advantage of, being blessed, and then having to try to figure out how to traverse the awkwardness that made between he and Laban. And here he is going through quite a literal wrestling match with his future, trying to figure out who he is, how he's going to be. And if you recall earlier, when he had left to go to his uncle's, when he had set up the pillar, when he saw Jacob's ladder descending, the whole thing about the staircase going up and back to heaven, he said, "If you will be with me, if you will preserve me in my ways, if you will bless me, then you will be my God." He's putting all these contingencies out there, saying, well, I'll follow you if. Right? He's giving God parameters for his obedience. And now we see a man who is willing to latch on, to grip, and to not let go. And he's going through this testing there, this phase afterwards, after he's coming back. Numbers chapter 14. This is one that is hard to overlook, especially when you're discussing the promised land and you're discussing the children of Israel and their wanderings. But in Numbers chapter 14, verse 34, Numbers 14, verse 34, the children of Israel go in to see what there is to see in the land of Canaan. They come back, they give their report, the 12 spies, and 10 out of 12, they're a little scared. Sore afraid, you might say. And in chapter 14, verse 34, according to the number of days which you spied out the land, this is God's judgment coming to them, according to the number of days in which you spied out the land, 40 days for each day, 40 days. For each day you shall bear your guilt 1 year, namely 40 years, and you shall know my rejection. I, the Lord, have spoken this. I will surely do so to all this evil congregation who is gathered together against me. In this wilderness they shall be consumed, and there they shall die. it can sound mean if you just look at it from the external vantage point. But this is also exactly what the children of Israel have been accusing God of the entire time leading up to this, whenever there's something bad. For all of this time that they're going through, saving them from Pharaoh, getting them through the Red Sea, making sure they have water, making sure they have food, giving them meat, what is their go-to complaint? Did you bring us out here to die? We'd have been better off to die back in Egypt. That's what they're saying all along the way. And God's like, oh, here it is. You get a year for a day for the time that you took to spy out the land. And so, not only were they tested in how they were going to view the land via the spies, but they're also then going through a period of testing, a period of judgment. And I found it interesting. It's like you're going to understand the rejection of the Lord. And you're going to get to see that God's saying, nope, not you, only those who are 20 years of age and younger. It says in verse 34, and you shall know my rejection. It's a pretty strong statement. Let's turn over to 1 Samuel 23. Another individual to whom the Jews thought quite highly of. 1 Samuel 23, verse 14. First Samuel chapter 23, verse 14. This is the account of David hiding from King Saul. If you recall, Saul decides to throw a javelin at his head, and David's like, maybe not welcome here. And so with the help of his first wife, Michal, and with the help of his best friend, Jonathan, he ends up fleeing from Saul. And in verse 14 here of 1 Samuel 23, we read that David stayed in strongholds in the wilderness and remained in the mountains in the wilderness of Ziph. Saul sought him every day, but God did not deliver him into his hand. And if you remember, we looked at all of those maps. If you were to look at the Dead Sea, that Judean wilderness, that would have been the mountainous portion, this would have been a similar place to where John the Baptist was actually in the wilderness there to the southwest of Jerusalem, not going over the Jordan or anything like that. But it is a wilderness, it is a barren place, and David is going through it from city to city, hiding in caves. We see that he's all the way over in En-Gedi at the tail end of this chapter. But David is being tested, and during this time that he's fleeing from Saul, you can see it as you read the account. Is David going to take the position for himself? Is David going to rely on God? Is he going to believe in the ordination to king that Samuel had done for him and just be like, okay, in God's time? Or is he going to try to take it? Say, wow, kind of like what, was it Jeroboam? Said, well, since you told, no, there's another king. Kids, you can help me out. It's like, well, since you told me I'm going to be the king, I'm going to make it happen, and I'm going to suffocate this guy, puts a wet pillow over the king's head, kills him, and takes over the position. So, I can't remember who it was, but I know it happened. You can find it. It's in Kings. So, anyway. But David is being tested here. And to know that you're like in the wings can be a difficult thing, but he is out there, he's in the wilderness, and he's getting tried. So for the children of Israel, primarily Judah at the time here, at the time of Jesus Christ, the wilderness is synonymous with testing. So you see this miraculous event where you hear a voice from heaven acknowledging Jesus Christ. The Holy Spirit comes down in the physical personage of a dove, manifestation of a dove, and then he goes to the wilderness. That would not be lost on people. If you go back to Matthew chapter 3, let's look and see there, because it's so interesting what Jesus' response was to John the Baptist when John says, you're coming to me to be baptized? What did Jesus say? He said in verse 15 of Matthew chapter 3, he said, permit it to be so now, for thus it is fitting to us to fulfill all righteousness. We've gone over a lot of details that are a part of the lineage, the location, just all those details that are in place for the life of Jesus. And here Jesus is saying we need to do this because all righteousness needs to be fulfilled. Matthew chapter 4, verse 1, we'll read again. It says, "And Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil." That's a pretty onerous sort of thing to have to engage in. Made me think of Job. Hold your spot here again. Let's go back to Job chapter 1. Job 1, verse 6 through 12 is where we'll be. Job chapter 1, verse 6. It's amazing the parallels that occur in Scripture. I shouldn't be amazed by it, but every time, the more you read, the more you just start, it becomes a spider web. It becomes so connected. It's amazing how God has crafted this for us and yet at the same time still given us free moral agency to make the selections that we have. And he shows this to us. Job 1, verse 6. "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan was all... let me rephrase that. There's a comma. I need to do the pause. "Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them." Big difference. So, I was thinking about this when I'm reading through about Jesus. You're out there. There's baptisms happening. People are saying, I'm going to change my life. Now, obviously, there's a different baptism. We recognize that there's a difference between the baptism of John the Baptist and the baptism of Jesus Christ, or offered through Jesus Christ. But people are wanting to change. And then there's the clear acknowledgement by God that this is my son. And then testing. So here in Job chapter 1, verse 6, so Satan's also among the individuals. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" And so Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? That there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil." Job's a pretty amazing guy. I think any of us would be happy to have that description of us, even with what Job went through after that. That's a pretty amazing description. And so Satan answered the Lord and said, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him, around his household and around all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand on his person." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So there are a couple of things that are happening here. Satan is saying, well, he's only obedient because you're protecting him. He's only obedient because you're protecting his family. Which sometimes, if you listen to any other Christian preachers, people will pray to have a hedge about them. Well, that's what Satan's accusation is, and what we see is God says, "Well, no, you've got everything but his person. You can affect." But you mirror this over with what we read in Matthew chapter 3, and we see an individual who, again, is presented before God, and then goes into the wilderness to be tested. Verse 2 of Matthew chapter 4, verse 2, speaking of Jesus, says, "When he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights afterward, he was hungry. And now when the tempter came to him," so Satan comes along after he's been fasting for 40 days. There's obviously the symbolism there of the 40 days, a day for a year, the testing that Israel went through in the wilderness. But you'll notice something, maybe perhaps you read over it, in verse 1, that Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He was led up by the Spirit. So he's inspired to go into the wilderness. This is where he has to go. It's not just, oh, I'm going to go where I want to. Now that I'm baptized and I'm 30 and people will listen to me, let's head on down to Jerusalem and tell them how it's supposed to be. That's not what he did. He's led out into the wilderness. Again, Jesus' words, that all righteousness might be fulfilled. But we see him tested. He's 40 days. He's out there. He's weak. There is no hedge around him. In fact, the very individual who was accused of putting a hedge about him is the one who guided him out there through the Spirit, said, hey, now you need to come out here. So nobody has any opportunity to question Jesus Christ, right? Because he goes out there. He willingly went out to go be tested. He's not getting chased by Saul. He's not worried about whether his brother is going to kill him. He's not sitting there trying to figure out whether he's going to be stuck in this wilderness area or whether he's actually going to inherit things. It's a choice to go out to go be tested, which is more than any of the other individuals that we read about. They happen to, dare I say, fall into those circumstances where they had the temptations, where they had the testing, where they had the trying at times. And Jesus actually made the decision to do that. Let's read through to verse 11 just to get the context here before we dive into the specific temptations and kind of parsing those out. So Jesus is led up, this is chapter 4, verse 1, we'll just read it all in its entirety. Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, afterward he was hungry. And when the tempter came to him, he said, if you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread. And he answered and said, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Then the devil took him into the holy city, set him on the pinnacle of the temple. And he said to him, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he shall give his angels charge over you, and in their hands they shall bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone. Verse 7, Jesus said to him, it is written again, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. Again the devil took him up on an exceedingly high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, all these things I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. And Jesus said to him, away with you, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve. And the devil left him, and behold, angels came and ministered to him. So Jesus willingly went out into the wilderness. He's fasting for 40 days. We have all of these parallels with the timing of everything that we've talked about before. He's at the right age to be able to do this. It's the right time. He takes the 40 days to do that, and he has these temptations. So I want to take, with the rest of the time today, a look at these three temptations that Satan puts before Jesus and consider what lessons we can take from those tests, from those temptations. Temptation number 1. If you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread. There's a lot that is there. Satan, first of all, is being smarmy as per normal. He's saying, if you're the Son of God, I've heard these things. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. Obviously, Jesus is hungry. He's been fasting for 40 days. But Christ responds, a wonderful quote. He says, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Now that is a quote for Deuteronomy chapter 8. Let's turn there. Keep your spot here in Matthew chapter 4. We'll go back to Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8, the first 3 verses is where we're actually going to read. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. It says, every commandment which I command you today, you must be careful to observe, that you may live and multiply and go and possess the land which the Lord swore to your fathers. And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So he humbled you, allowed you to hunger, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. The context of this is pretty amazing because it's hearkening back to exactly what Israel didn't do. It's not a hungry question. This has had, dare I say, nothing to do with food. Food happens to be the conduit of weakness that is at play here. But the case, and if you go back, you can read about manna. Manna was a test to see if people would observe the Sabbath. That's what God said it as. It was a test to see whether or not they would keep the Sabbath and do what God said. But there was a miracle for 40 years that they received manna in the wilderness. They received the daily sustenance 6 days a week, right? They're receiving it, and then twice, obviously, on the Friday. But Jesus' reply here harkens back to, again, this entirety of what is here in Deuteronomy 8, and a large part of that is remembering God. If you remember what God has done for you, if you remember anything that somebody has done for you, if a person has helped you out in a difficult time, they've given you a loan, they've come and picked you up from, if you were in the wrong end of town, whatever the example is, you remember those things, right? You store them away. You say, oh, that's a good friend. That's a great person. And what we have in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, it's like, you remember, God took care of you. He brought you out of Egypt. He provided for you. And so if there happens to be a little bit of hunger, are you able to last just a little? Do you trust that God is going to take care of you? This is a trusting in God question. But also, while there is that portion of it, there's also a little bit of duality. Let's jump up to John chapter 6. John chapter 6. It is not just circumstantial that I think that it is Jesus, oftentimes as the God of the Old Testament, who's interacting with the children of Israel. He is the Word, and so if you don't just live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, and you have the Word who is coming here in human form to die for us, and to, as we read here in John chapter 6, verse 26, John chapter 6, verse 26, there had already been one of the miracles where people were fed. And here in John 6, verse 26, he goes to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and they come and they find him, and they said, Rabbi, how'd you get here? And he answers and said to them, most assuredly I say to you, you seek me not because you saw the signs, it's a miracle, not because of that, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him. Let's jump down to verse 35. And Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. How can you tell people not to worry about what they're going to eat if you have not been there? It's like, what do they call them? Trust fund babies, right? If you're like, oh, you haven't known a hard day in your life. What do you mean coming here to tell me what I need to do about stuff? Whatever. You may have had this thought. Well, he was God. I mean, was it that hard? And it can be difficult to go and read that he was in all points tempted as us, just, as we are, but without sin. We're like, but he was, we'll make this whatever buffer zone is that for 40 Exodus 17, verses 1 through 7. Exodus 17, verse 1. Then all the congregation of the children of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sin, according to the commandment of God, and camped in Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people contended with Moses and said, "Give us water that we may drink." So Moses said to them, "Why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord?" And the people thirsted there for water. And the people complained against Moses and said, "Why is it you have brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do with this people? They're almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Go on before the people, and take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand your rod with which you struck the river, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, and the people may drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the contention of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Now, you remember when we were talking about the importance of water, obviously you need water for baptism. But here the children of Israel confronted with water, and their question is God with us or not? They didn't put together the link that water, life, bread, all of these very not well hidden. I mean, they're pretty plain connections. If you have no food, you die. If you have no water, you die, right? You don't have the protection from Pharaoh. You're going to be dead. And yet God is there at every step, providing it all along the way. And they're not equating God with life. And here we are with Jesus Christ. And Satan is tempting him and saying, "Oh, would you like to put yourself into the place of defining what God should do for you?" So the first one is about the food. And the first one is, oh, are you going to remember what God has done? Or do you think that you need to make things happen yourself? The second one is, are you going to sit there and try to tell God how he's supposed to help you? I'm up here on this cliff, and I'm telling you, I'm pretty sure I'm supposed to jump off. We're over here looking at this church building. I know it's the right one. I don't know. We're asking. We're seeking. We don't know. And that's okay to be in that spot, to wait as Moses told the people. At times you stand and you see the deliverance of God. And at other times, well, what are you doing? Move and go forward. And it can be a juggle for us to try to figure out which is which. But again, we see here Jesus perfectly, deftly traversing that. And his victory in this case, showing that the foundation that he was on, the foundation that was in place, that he's there to do his Father's business, not his own. So he deferred to the Father there. It's not me saying, I think that this is going to be what's going to show people. I mean, because again, you're in Jerusalem. Everything is happening in and around the temple. Everything's happening in and around. You got a Roman garrison that's right next to the temple. You remember that from when Paul got arrested. They had to come out and get him really quick because they noticed there's a hubbub. But everything's happening around there. Sacrifices are going on. If you're the guy to David Blaine it up and just jump off and not die, people can be like, whoa. I don't know if anybody knows who David Blaine is, if you care. He's a magician. Anyway. So, David Copperfield. There we go. Different magician. Make stuff disappear. But if you jump off of the 150 feet and you don't die and you don't dash your feet against the stone, instant audience, right? Now we're going to listen to you. I mean, what did the Jews consistently ask Jesus for? What sign are you going to show us that we will believe you? He had to be pretty sick of hearing that. But he forgoes that. He says, no, God's will. Let's go to John chapter 6, a section that we didn't read the first time. John 6, verse 29. We'll read through verse 33. John 6, verse 29. John chapter 6, verse 29, and Jesus answered and said to them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he sent." Therefore they said to him, "What sign will you perform that we may see it and believe you? What work will you do?" "Our fathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." And Jesus said to them, "Most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Obviously speaking of himself. He's able to say this. He's deferring back to God, what God is sending, what God is doing. John 14, verse 10. John 14, verse 10. Again, Jesus speaking here. He's speaking to his disciples, though Philip had asked him a question. And he says, do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father in me? The words that I speak to you, I do not speak on my own authority. But the Father who dwells in me, does the works. Jesus is attributing everything back to God. He's there. He's taken up onto the pinnacle of the temple. If he makes it about him, it's done. It's over. He hasn't fully submitted to God and the plan. It's now about him, and he overcame that. Back in Matthew chapter 4. Temptation number 3. Temptation number 3. Matthew chapter 4, verse 9. Satan says to him, all these things I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. This seems like the most straightforward and abrupt sort of temptation. Because we're like, obviously, if you're hungry, you got to eat. Well, if God says he's going to save me, I'm pretty certain he's going to save me, right? We pray these prayers at times when we're asking for healing, when we're asking for intervention, we're asking for guidance. But if somebody just comes out of the gate and says, bow down to me and I'll give you everything, we're like, clearly no. Obviously. But I think that Jesus Christ's response speaks a little bit more maybe to the heart of what Satan was trying to get at. Because Jesus' response says, away with you, Satan. Now this phrase is similar to one that you could find in Matthew 16. Let's turn there. Just a little bit down the way. Matthew 16. Verse 23. Matthew 16. I can't go a message without doing it. We're going to start in verse 21. Matthew 16, verse 21. So from that time, Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised the third day. So he's letting his disciples know this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord, that this should happen to you. This is not supposed to happen. It's kind of like, you could say, the chastising maybe that John the Baptist is like, are you coming to me to be baptized? So he's got Peter saying this to him, and Jesus' response, he turned to him and said, get behind me, Satan. It's the same phraseology, away with you, Satan, that you read in Matthew chapter 4. Get behind me, Satan. But let's read the rest of what Christ's response here is to Peter. You are an offense to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men. It might sound harsh to say this to Peter, but this is almost a carbon copy response to what he had to say to Satan when Satan said, bow down to me. Because he's like offering him the things of men. And Jesus very quickly discerns the difference. What human being does not want to leave their indelible mark on society, on their children, on the larger work as a whole? Wouldn't it be nice to be remembered for doing the right thing, to have what was written of Job, this amazing guy who's blameless? It's like we all want to leave our mark, and Jesus is saying, get behind me, Satan, away with you. Peter, you don't even realize what you're doing. You're mindful of the things of men, not the things of God. And he says over in Matthew chapter 4, to Satan, he says, away with you, Satan. Because Satan's mindful of the things of men, not the things of God. You can't understand the things of God unless you have the Spirit of God in you. He goes on, Matthew chapter 4, verse 10, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve. Can you guess where he went to quote that? If you guessed Deuteronomy, you're right. Let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6. We've already been to this chapter. Deuteronomy chapter 6. This one is actually from verse 13. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 13, it says, "You shall fear the Lord your God and serve him, and shall take oaths in his name." Now, we've already read a little bit of the context, but I wanted to read it again by going back to verse 10 of chapter 6, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 10. It says, "So it shall be when the Lord your God brings you into the land of which he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you large and beautiful cities which you did not build, houses full of good things which you did not fill, hewn out wells which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant. When you have eaten and are full, then beware lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. You shall fear the Lord your God and serve him, and shall take oaths in his name. You shall not go after other gods, the gods of the peoples who are around you. For the Lord your God is a jealous God among you, lest the anger of the Lord your God be aroused against you and destroy you from the face of the earth." And that is what Jesus quoted back, or referenced back, to Satan. Because if you don't know who you're serving, you don't understand who God is, then you can easily justify, or more easily justify, him being okay with something that you're doing. You're like, he'll understand why I had to jump off the pinnacle. He'll understand why I had to bow down in this circumstance. And Jesus is saying there's no circumstance wherein that is okay. This is something that if you understand how jealous our God is, there is no alternative. He's pointing everybody back to God. And again, so much of what Jesus was doing set the stage for what he needed to do down the road. If you go to Matthew chapter 11, verse 27. Matthew chapter 11, verse 27 to 30, Jesus says, "All things have been delivered to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father. Nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and the one to whom the Son wills to reveal him." So if you want to know the Father, the Son has to show you. So if you want to really truly understand how jealous he is, how zealous he is, how much he loves you as a child, how much he's willing to invest, how much he's willing to sacrifice, if you want to know that about God the Father, you must have it revealed to you from Jesus. And he's only going to reveal it to those whom God brings to him. So you have this relationship that is going there. And really, the truth of the matter is, Satan has no way to grasp that. He's so selfishly warped. He doesn't understand that relationship. And he's saying, okay, just bow down to me. And Jesus, no, let's go back to the Father. Let's go back to what he wants for all of mankind. These three temptations really did set the stage for Jesus to be able to teach and preach what he did. Let's wrap up here. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 6. We'll read verses 14 through 18. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 14 through 18. It says, "Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? What communion has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what part has a believer with an unbeliever? And what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For you are the temple of the living God, as God has said, I will dwell in them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore, come out from among them and be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will receive you. I will be a father to you, and you shall be my sons and daughters, says the Lord Almighty." Now we can look at this and we can talk about relationships interpersonally. But hopefully, as we're prepping for the Passover, we might take a look at this and think about it, instead of interpersonal relationship, interpersonal relationship. Because it's so easy for us to take our relationship with God and forget what he's done for us in the past. To forget what he wants from us. To think that perhaps we are defining terms, as Jacob did originally. and as Jesus Christ was unwilling to do when he's tempted by Satan. It's so easy to do that. We need to make sure that we are not yoking ourselves to a different mindset, a wrong mindset in how we look at our relationship with our Father. Last verse, if you turn with me over to James chapter 4. James chapter 4. We'll read the first 10 verses because I think this really does sum up what we got to witness as we're going through these temptations that Satan is presenting to Jesus. James chapter 4, verse 1. Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you don't receive because you ask amiss that you may spend it on your own pleasures. Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you think that the Scripture says in vain, the Spirit which dwells in us yearns jealously? For he gives more grace. Therefore he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore, submit to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. When it comes to our relationship with God, just as Jesus exemplified here, there is absolutely no in-between. Israel wanted to remember the nice things from their previous life and call out God whenever he didn't attain to those. They weren't there remembering everything that God did for them. In the midst of their wilderness journey, they failed to remember who God was, who God is, and what he was doing for them. In the midst of our trials, when we're going through the wilderness, when we have things that are placed in front of us, we need to make sure that we remember these lessons that Jesus showed us through how he responded to these temptations. We need to make sure that we remember what God does for us. We need to remember that it is our job to be beside God, not trying to pull him over to where we are. And we also need to remember that our Father is jealous. And it's not jealous in a bad way, unless you're doing bad things. It's jealous in a good way. He wants us. He so jealously wants us to not be with anyone else, that we would be his children. And we need to make sure that we let that inform how we proceed with anything we encounter.